Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. CBS News Elections Director Anthony Salvanto joins us with new battleground tracker poll results. All right, Anthony, let's start in Iowa. Ted Cruz is on the rise. What's behind that?
It's a really direct transfer from Ben Carson's voters to Ted Cruz. You might recall earlier this fall, Ben Carson was really up there. In fact, he was tied with Donald Trump at one point. Well, as his voters have fallen away, they've moved to Ted Cruz in much larger numbers than to anybody else. In fact, we actually re-interviewed those same voters, and they told us that in larger numbers, they were choosing Cruz. Some of them went to Trump, some of them went to Rubio, but Cruz has really gotten the lion's share there. And, you know, it looks like evangelical voters really asserting themselves here, as they do in Iowa. They make up the bulk of Republican caucus goers. And if you look at what people say is their number one issue, well, for most it's terrorism, and there's a lot that say the economy. But for those voters who say that faith and values and religious matters are number one, that's where Cruz really has an enormous lead over Trump. That's the difference.
So if Cruz is pulling from the evangelicals, taking them away from Ben Carson, what's happening to the Trump vote? Is he pretty much staying solid?
It's rock steady. You know, you look at those same individuals again, re-interviewed, they stay with Donald Trump. And, you know,
And you've been interviewing them over a period of time. In other words, there's been, you know, challenge after challenge to Donald Trump that could knock them off, but no, they're sticking with him.
They stick with him, and you know, as you've seen in your focus groups and others, you know, everybody says, oh, Donald Trump says something controversial, he must go down. Surely Donald Trump will go down. Well, he doesn't go down, and his voters stay with him. And in fact, Republicans in Iowa say that in general, they are glad he says the things that he says. They think, even if they don't agree, although many do, that they're glad these things are out there and being discussed.
So, and that's happening with him in New Hampshire as well as Iowa. It's pretty much the case with Donald Trump everywhere. What else are you seeing in New Hampshire?
New Hampshire, Donald Trump still at number one, still holding steady. You do see another move there, a little bit to Cruz from Carson, but you've got Rubio then in contention. He's in double digits there. He's in double digits everywhere. And now Chris Christie. Hey, he has doubled his support from last time in New Hampshire. So he's in that second tier there now. A little bit of evidence that retail politics is helping him, people who say they like seeing the candidates in person, but also he, along with Donald Trump, seen as effective. That's how they describe him. That's different from, say, Marco Rubio. His calling card there in New Hampshire looks like electability. And where that's different from effective is that's a little bit of how you define mainstream, in that as voters start to play political consultant, you know, and they look ahead to that general election, they're looking for somebody who's electable, whereas that disaffected group of Republicans who think that government doesn't work anymore, that's where you go for the effective candidate. They think they can get conservative things done.
Although I wonder if in an age of jitteriness and fright that we've seen in response to these terror attacks, whether effectiveness is also about who's going to keep me safe as opposed to who can get elected.
It certainly is. And there are some numbers that really jumped out here where 9 in 10 Republicans say that they feel the U.S. is becoming more dangerous and insecure. I mean, we just don't see those kinds of overwhelming numbers almost no matter what you ask. So it speaks to your point about that anxiety, but also that's layered on top of economic insecurity too, which has been throughout this whole campaign. Again, 8, 9, and 10 of these Republican voters say they feel the U.S. economic system doesn't help them. And when you think that the system doesn't work, it's not just that things are going in the wrong direction. That's where you go to a candidate that might say, change the whole system, blow it all up.
All right, so if that's what's happening on the Republican side, let's now switch over to the Democratic side. They had a debate last night. What do the numbers show for those three folks running for the Democratic nomination?
Well, Hillary Clinton stays up in Iowa. Bernie Sanders stays up fairly large in New Hampshire. Okay. Now, in Iowa, what you see is Bernie Sanders having a really hard time getting traction. And, you know, I think that will probably mean that Hillary Clinton will end up getting the lion's share of delegates there if it stays the same. But what's interesting about this whole race, John, is that Democrats are happy with the tone and tenor of it. They don't necessarily want to see these two candidates go at each other any more than they already are. We asked them, do you want to see Bernie Sanders be more critical of Hillary Clinton? And his voters say, no, they're just fine with that. In fact, if you ask Bernie Sanders, how do you feel about Hillary Clinton? They like her. They say they just like Bernie Sanders better. And you ask her voters what they think of Bernie Sanders' message, they like it. They just happen to like Hillary better. So there's not a sense of, hey, let's be more combative here. Hey, it's a family squabble, but there still seems like there's a lot of love between the two of them.
Right, so they can squabble on the issues, but it's all a hug at the end of the debate, which is essentially what we saw. All right, Anthony Salvanto, thanks so much.
Thank you, John.
We'll be back in a moment. Joining us now for political analysis is Wall Street Journal columnist and CBS News contributor Peggy Noonan, Democratic strategist and CNN senior political commentator David Axelrod, chief correspondent of The Washington Post Dan Balls, and The Atlantic's national correspondent Jeffrey Goldberg. Welcome to all of you. We have two debates this week on both sides. Let's start with the Republican debate. And now, Dan, we have two debates within the Republican debate. Let's start with Cruz Rubio. What's that about?
Two things, John. One, I think each of them and each of their campaigns believes that they are going to be in a final showdown with the other. And so they've been preparing for this. They've done all the opposition research on one another, and it's now coming out. The second is that Cruz's strategy is to consolidate a broader piece of the conservative part of the Republican Party, the most conservative part, than anybody's ever been able to do. And Rubio is trying to crowd into some of that territory. And so Rubio is trying to suggest that Cruz is not as conservative, say, on immigration as he claims, and Cruz is trying to hold the line and put down a firmer and firmer conservative position on that. So the dynamic of that is what we've seen play out this week.
Yeah, Peggy, it seems to be the Cruz, taking a look at the Cruz strategy here, which is to tie Marco Rubio to his support for the Gang of Eight, the comprehensive immigration reform that passed in the Senate, to just lock him to that.
Yeah.
How damaging do you think that is in the Republican side to be associated with comprehensive immigration reform?
Well, we'll see. It's not where the base is. I think if we've learned anything this year, it is that the base of the Republican Party is against illegal immigration and wants something done. The establishment elites, the top, if you will, has for 15 years not been so anti-illegal immigration. So there's a difference. And if you're a candidate right now, you're trying to talk to the base of the party. I think part of what's going on with Cruz and Rubio is that by the end of New Hampshire, say, there's going to be Trump and there's going to be two viable non-Trumps, and each of them, Cruz and Rubio, is trying to be the top viable non-Trump. I sort of think that's going on. I also think Rubio is trying very hard to paint Ted Cruz as someone who simply isn't trustworthy. He doesn't tell you the truth. I think that's what's going on there.
Right, that's the bigger,
do.
message in what he's doing. David, when you look at this, it seems like what happened is Marco Rubio now has to own his sponsorship of the Gang of Eight comprehensive immigration reform. And as Dan said, Ted Cruz has now gone from, for whatever reason, flirting with the idea of legalization. He says it was a strategic move he was doing at the time. Marco Rubio says it showed his true intent. Whatever, his view now, Cruz, no path to anything, no how for anybody illegal. Which of those positions would do better in a general election context?
Well, obviously, the more severe a position you take against immigration reform, the more difficult it is. We saw Mitt Romney struggled with this in 2012. He ended up with 27% of the Hispanic vote, which was really crippling for him. George W. Bush, who was the last Republican to win, won 44%. And we're becoming a more diverse country with each election. But the interesting thing to me about the fight between these two, Rubio's clearly trying to obviate what he sees as a vulnerability. I think it's a larger vulnerability within the party than the issue itself. Notice Cruz always calls it the Schumer-Rubio bill. It's the notion that he was complicit with Democrats, and the base of the Republican Party is tired of Republicans being complicit with Democrats. They're frustrated. They want more purity. And Ted Cruz has played to that. Ted Cruz understands where his base is. Marco Rubio's tried to please every faction of the Republican Party, and he may just end up as everybody's second choice.
That's right. Well, Jeffrey, in the ad that Ted Cruz is running, there's, if you can get a picture of Schumer and Rubio in the same frame, it makes the point that David is making. Whereas the Rubio case against Cruz is one that that is more, you have to kind of follow what he used to say, and you get
Right,
kind of a back and forth.
Right. Well, no, but I mean, going to Peggy's point, it's about trustworthiness, and if Marco Rubio can convince some of the Republican base that Ted Cruz is no different than the Washington politicians he claims to hate more than anyone else in the race, then Rubio feels that he's getting somewhere. But I would go back. This is the worry if you're Rubio, just to add on to something David was saying. The worry that you're Rubio is that you're everyone's fallback date. And he could be extraordinarily popular and come in second or third everywhere, and I think that's my sense from talking to people over the last week is that the Rubio campaign is now seized by this concern.
Well, what is Rubio's path, Dan? I spent some time this week talking to folks in Iowa, and they thought, well, it's not happening here. Ted Cruz is on the rise, and they want to find a path for Marco Rubio, but they didn't see it.
It is hard to find. Iowa is not his best state by far. New Hampshire is a muddle right now. Donald Trump stands above everybody else, but that state is in flux, and you can see from the new polling numbers that you all have this morning how much dynamism there is in that race. South Carolina at this point doesn't look particularly good for Rubio. There are some Rubio people who think it ultimately could be. It leaves you with Nevada. And as we've talked before, of the first 4 states, Nevada is the 5th. It's in importance. It just doesn't have the kind of weight that the other 3 have. So he has to figure out a way to be high up in all of those states and hope that that's enough to keep him moving.
Because that goes back to your point, Peggy, about a non-Trump candidate. I mean, the way people I was talking to were talking about it this week is they put Trump and Cruz in the same basket. So they're looking for a mainstream candidate, and they were hoping that Rubio would come out of this debate not being that, and he didn't, and the field is split. There are several non-Trump candidates.
Yes, and there's the sense that Cruz is on the up-a-later in some way, and Rubio is on the down-a-later. I want to mention something that I think the Republicans are making a mistake on. The cumulative effect of what they say at their debates. I love it that they're fighting and hitting each other over the head and occasionally addressing serious issues in a serious way. But the cumulative effect of the sort of harshness and even unlovingness of their rhetoric on immigration is going to, in the end, hurt them. I also think the sort of severity and drama of their language on ISIS makes them look radical. Do you know what I mean? As opposed
Panicky?
to people
Like panicky?
Not panicky, Jeffrey, but extreme.
Does it
Do you know what I mean?
There's a belligerence to the
Yes,
talk.
there is. That's
it goes
actually
beyond
the word.
muscularity
And
to belligerence.
yes, and you don't
carpet
have to be
bombing.
belligerent.
I mean, when you start talking about carpet bombing whole cities,
Yes, and
in response to
turning
a number.
deserts to glass and stuff like that. You can be very strong, very definitive, very seriousness, but not use this harsh, severe, over-the-top rhetoric. It's misunderstanding their own base, I think.
The reality, though, is, and Jeff's written about this, there are no easy answers to the situation that we face there. And so the substitute for a coherent answer is bellicosity. Let's be as strong, because I think people are tired of the complexity of the situation, and they're responding to strength, and that's how that translates into the kind of language that you're talking
They
about.
do want strength. They don't want braggadocio and carelessness.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you.
Well, but they seem to want that. I mean, what is Donald Trump giving them but braggadocio and carelessness? And he remains, no matter what he says, he maintains his numbers. So
But
I mean,
Oddly
maybe
enough, on
somebody.
ISIS, he doesn't talk
Christie,
like
too,
that.
in the debate
But I'm sorry.
was just almost reflexively
Steamrolling.
talking about shooting down Russian planes. This
Yeah,
is
But
a, this
we
is
are 2 countries, and let's remember that there's a primary electorate and then there's a general election. And I agree with you, in the general electorate, that kind of rhetoric can be crippling. But in the primary, and given the sort of red-hot nature of the Republican base, you get the effect that you see with Trump, where people are responding. He is the anti-Obama. I always believe that the incumbent sets the terms of the debate, and people never choose the replica of what they have, particularly the other party. They choose the remedy, and there's no one more there's no more of an antithesis to Barack Obama than Donald Trump.
Jeffrey, give us your read on let's stick on the Republican side here for the moment, the foreign policy critique of the president. Were there some proposals where you said that is a distinction from the president that represents a clear break in vision that people could rally behind. If
Well, the guy with the most original concept is polling at 0 right now, Lindsey Graham, who actually talks about ground troops. I mean, the thing that's really noticeable, obviously, in what the Republican debate has this unreal quality to it, because they're talking as if President Obama is not doing the things that he's doing, and they're talking about, and again, we've talked about this in the past, there's this kind of pick one from column A, pick one from column B approach. Everyone has their little idea, the no-fly zone, a safe zone, a Sunni army materializing out of nowhere, and these are all things that President Obama is trying to some degree or another, not the safe zone yet, and not the no-fly zone, but they're proposing tactics, and they're suggesting that a war is not actually taking place already. There's nothing very original that I'm hearing yet from most of these Republican candidates. That's the simple truth of it.
All right, we'll take a break right there. We'll be right back with more from our panel. We're back now with more of our panel. Jeffrey, I want to stick on the Republican side. Donald Trump got some praise from Vladimir Putin this week, which he seemed to like.
Yes, he did, and you know, I've been thinking about this all week. I can't recall a similar experience in which the leading candidate for one of the major parties is praising and receiving praise from a former KGB. I mean, he's a former KGB official who is the despot running an adversarial country, Russia, and Trump's sanguine approach to this, or actually his pleasure at this, seems without precedent. And I thought, okay, this is the moment when the Republican base, which is pro-America and anti-Russia, might say, maybe this guy is off his rocker. I don't know, but it seems as if we're just gliding right past this crossed line. The whole point of this campaign seems to be to cross lines. And I can't remember, not since World War II have we felt so warmly about, seen a candidate feel so warmly about a Russian leader.
Although George W. Bush did say he looked into his soul and saw that he was a good person.
Not the greatest moment. Not the greatest moment in the George W. Bush presidency.
Something his brother apparently doesn't agree with. Yeah. But no, listen, Trump. You say that you think he's crossed the line. Maybe people will say he's off his rocker. They've had ample opportunity to make this judgment along the way, and they've rejected it. He seems to be, at least with his base, impervious to that. The question is, can he grow? How much can he grow?
One thing to be bigoted against Mexicans. I mean, it's a terrible thing. But I understand it in the politics of the immigration debate. To talk about an adversary, a foremost adversary, as someone worthy of praise and worthy of receiving praise.
He seems to enjoy flattery.
I was just going to say, there's a curious quality about him. I mean, we think of him as the insult candidate, and yet when somebody or something is nice to him, whether it's a new poll or Vladimir Putin, he embraces that, and he gives it back. And so, it's just the nature of his personality that he seeks to be liked.
Well, that seems somewhat dangerous, doesn't it?
I'm not arguing that.
Going back to our conversation about strength, and the strength above all, he said he's strong and he's a leader. Peggy, when challenged on this and told that Vladimir Putin kills journalists, he said, well, America kills people too.
Yes, that was an unusual answer. I'm
well, it's
not
unusual.
Totally sure what it meant, actually, what he was referring to. He doesn't mean America kills.
He means in wars, America kills people, and so he was drawing an equivalence there.
All right. I'm not sure what he meant, but I think part of the Putin-Trump story is that people understand that Putin loves to make mischief. He has a mischievous side. I think a number of people interpreted Putin's praise of Trump to be an implicit criticism of Obama, who he's been asked about in the past and who he's damned with faint praise. Do you know what I mean? This is showing, I don't like Obama, I like even this guy better. I think a number of people saw it a little bit like that.
David, Donald Trump is also accepting praise, and there's an affectionate and warm relationship with Ted Cruz. They're close in Iowa. What did you make? Yeah, most of the time, but in the debate in particular, they chose to be allies. What do you make of that?
I was kind of surprised by that because I thought that I think Cruz is a real threat to Trump, and you can see it in these Iowa numbers. Cruz had said some unkind things about Trump in private. He was asked about it. Trump had the opportunity to do what Rubio's trying to do and say, you know what, That's what politicians in Washington do. They say one thing in a room to their donors, and they say another thing in public. And he said, I don't play that game. I tell you what I think, and Ted, you should speak up here and say to me what you said to those donors in the room. But going to Dan's point, you know, the truth is he's never really confrontational in that way unless someone attacks him.
Right.
And Cruz has figured that out, and Cruz is, as he said in that room, he's hugging him because he thinks if he hugs him, then Trump won't turn his guns on him.
What do you make, Dan, of Bush's decision to go after Trump? Pretty much every time he speaks now, he's got a shot at Trump. Is this going to work for him?
I don't know if it's going to work, John. I mean, he's got so many other problems, as the polling indicates, and as we've known for many months, that I don't know whether this will move him into a really competitive position. But he's clearly been liberated in some way, as he suggested to you, to really take on Trump. I mean, it's clear that he dislikes Trump. He thinks Trump is not, as he said, a serious candidate for president. It offends him. I mean, he is the son and brother of former presidents. He knows what a president ought to look like, and Trump doesn't fit that model. And so he's decided to go after him. Partly, I think, to just kind of get it off his chest, and then they'll see where they go.
Also, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you know, it's liberating to be so down low in the polls.
He needed a foil. He needed something to define his candidacy, and he's found it in Trump. The question is whether there's time and whether ultimately he's the right guy for these times.
Peggy, is he standing up for something larger, though? He seems to claim that he is. In other words, somebody's got to stand up for sort of a sense of principles and rules, and this is what the Republican Party is about, not just I'm losing to Donald Trump.
And Bush has an opening here. You can be liberated by losing. Do you know what I mean? All of a sudden, you're not fighting to hold on to number one or number two. You're way back in the pack. It's not working. Then have a good time and get serious. Bush's opportunity here is not to go and say, Trump's a jerk. Do you know what I mean? It's to do a serious speech and serious statements about what's wrong with Trumpism and Trump. Be serious and thoughtful about it.
But people have tried that with little success. I mean, beginning with Rick Perry, who gave a very strong speech last July, and
that's
we
true.
haven't mentioned
But
Rick
timing
Perry.
is everything. Timing's everything.
The broader public service here is for Bush to say, you know what, if you don't know what the nuclear triad is, you shouldn't be president, and you shouldn't be running for president.
Right. That's the last word, Jeffrey. Thanks, all of you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back in a moment. That's it for us today. Next week, we'll be looking back at 2015 with Stephen Colbert, and we'll talk to NASA Commander Scott Kelly from space. Be sure to join us. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.